My name is Anna, and for the first 17 years of my life, I was a ghost living in my own home. My entire existence was a carefully constructed lie, but I was the only one who didn't know it. To my adoptive parents, Robert and Eleanor Winston, I was less a daughter and more of a mistake they were desperately, quietly trying to erase. They never truly saw me. They never truly heard me. I was the silent echo in pristine hallways, the empty chair at the dinner table that was somehow still occupied by a palpable void. I was a black girl in a white home, a fact that seemed to define not who I was, but what I wasn't. Theirs. They gave me a roof, clothes, and food, but they systematically starved me of the one thing a child cannot possibly survive without: the feeling of being seen. Before I continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, comment below, and leave your like. Helps a lot. A judge was about to change everything. He was about to force them to see me, to finally face what they'd done in the cold, unforgiving light of a courtroom. And in doing so, he wouldn't just uncover their years of calculated neglect. He would unearth a secret about my very origins. A secret buried so deep it was never, ever meant to be found. A secret that would not only unravel their entire world but, in the process, give me back my own. Section 1. The Invisible Child. To the outside world, the Winstons were pillars of the community. He was a respected partner at a prestigious downtown law firm. She was a prominent figure in local charities, her picture often appearing in the society pages. Their sprawling, immaculate house sat on a tree-lined street where perfect families raised perfect children. They had everything they could ever want, except a child of their own. And then they got me. They told their friends and colleagues it was a benevolent, colorblind act of Christian charity, a narrative that painted them as saints. But inside those beautifully decorated walls, it wasn't charity. It was a chore. A burden they bore with a silent, resentful sigh. I learned the geography of my own home by the paths I memorized to avoid them. I knew that the third stair from the bottom creaked, a betrayal that would announce my presence if I wasn't careful. I learned to make my own breakfast in the pre-dawn quiet, long before they came downstairs, and to vanish into my room the moment I returned from school. My presence in the living room, reading a book or doing homework, felt like an intrusion on their quiet, ordered life, like a smudge on a perfect painting. They only ever spoke to me in clipped, functional sentences, devoid of any warmth. Dinner's in 10 minutes. Did you finish your homework? Don't leave your shoes there. There were never any follow-up questions, no curiosity about my day, my friends, or how I was feeling. I was a line item on a budget, a task to be managed. Their eyes would slide right past me, as if I were a piece of furniture they'd grown tired of dusting. I was a living, breathing reminder of a choice they seemed to regret with every passing day. I remember my 10th birthday with a clarity that still aches like a phantom limb. A week before, in a rare moment I foolishly mistook for interest, Eleanor asked what kind of cake I wanted. Strawberry, I'd said, my favorite. The word felt foreign and loud in our perpetually quiet kitchen. For 7 days, I floated on a fragile, buzzing hope. This year would be different. This year they'd finally see me. This year I would be a real girl. The morning of my birthday arrived. I crept downstairs, my heart hammering against my ribs with a frantic, hopeful rhythm. The house was silent. No happy birthday banner. No presents wrapped in cheerful paper on the table. Just the usual, suffocating quiet. Robert was at the table, engrossed in the financial section of the newspaper. Eleanor was meticulously watering her orchids, her back to me. They didn't look up. Not once. I was invisible all over again. I waited all day, a shrinking, hopeful creature, telling myself they were planning a surprise party for the evening. I sat in my room, tracing the floral patterns on my wallpaper, my ears straining for the sound of guests arriving or the rustle of gift wrap. Nothing. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across my floor, a cold, hard knot formed in the pit of my stomach. That precious little bit of hope curdled into the familiar, hot sting of shame. Finally, when the silence became too much to bear, I went to the kitchen. I pulled out the flour, the sugar, the eggs. I found a recipe for a simple vanilla cake in one of Eleanor's pristine cookbooks. My hands were clumsy, and I spilled flour on my shirt, but I just kept mixing, the scrape of the wooden spoon against the ceramic bowl the only sound in the house. As the small, lopsided cake baked, filling the air with a sweet scent that felt like a mockery, I found a single, forgotten candle in a junk drawer. When it was done, I placed the candle in the center and lit it. The tiny flame flickered, casting a lonely glow in the dimming kitchen. I didn't sing to myself. I just closed my eyes, smelling the warm sugar and vanilla, and made a wish. I wished that anyone would see me. When I opened my eyes, the kitchen was still empty. I blew out the candle, cut a slice of the still-too-hot cake, and ate it alone at the counter. The tears I refused to let fall made the sweet frosting taste like salt. That was my life. A series of moments where my own existence was a question I was too afraid to ask and they were unwilling to answer. The neglect wasn't loud or violent. It was a quiet, suffocating blanket of indifference that was slowly smothering my spirit. I wasn't their daughter. I was their ghost. This slow erasure went on for years, noticed only by the occasional teacher who would frown with concern during parent-teacher conferences my parents rarely, if ever, attended. Anna is a wonderful student, so bright, but she's so quiet, they'd say. Almost withdrawn. Reports were filed, and concerns were noted in my school file, but the Winstons looked perfect on the outside, and the system is tragically slow to challenge respectable, wealthy people. Then, when I was 17, something shifted. A new social worker, a woman named Ms. Diaz, was assigned to my case for a routine review. Unlike everyone else, she had sharp, kind eyes that didn't slide past me. She looked at me and actually saw me. She read the long, dusty history of reports from my school, the notes from counselors about my isolation, the concerns from the school nurse about recurring, untreated ailments. She saw the pattern that Robert and Eleanor had so expertly hidden in plain sight. And she did something about it. It didn't start with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, official-looking envelope that arrived in the mail. I watched from the top of the stairs, a familiar vantage point for observing the family I was never a part of. I saw Robert open it. His face, usually a mask of calm indifference, tightened into a rigid knot. He handed the letter to Eleanor, whose hand flew to her mouth in a gesture of shock. For the first time in years, they looked at each other and had a real conversation, their whispers sharp and panicked. It was about me. The letter was a summons to appear in family court for a hearing regarding my welfare and their parental fitness. The system that had been a distant, ineffective hum in the background of my life was now roaring to the forefront. The ghost they had ignored for 17 years was about to become the one person they could not avoid. Section 2. The wounds that didn't bleed. But to truly understand how we ended up in that courtroom, you have to understand that the silence in that house wasn't empty. It was filled with 1,000 small moments, 1,000 tiny cuts that never bled but left deep, invisible scars on my soul. It wasn't just forgotten birthdays. It was a constant, casual dismissal of my body and my needs. When I was 14, I was running drills in gym class and my foot landed awkwardly. I heard a sickening crack in my ankle and felt a surge of white-hot, blinding pain. The school nurse, a kind woman named Mrs. Gable, took one look at the rapid swelling and the purple blooming under my skin and said I needed to go to the emergency room immediately. She called my mother. I can still hear Eleanor's voice over the phone, thin and laced with annoyance. "Oh, for heaven's sake. She's always so dramatic. Just give her some ice and have her sit down. She'll be fine." Mrs. Gable, to her immense credit, pushed back, her voice firm. "Mrs. Winston, I really must insist. The ankle is severely swollen and discolored. I am not a doctor, but this looks like a possible fracture." A heavy, put-upon sigh crackled through the receiver. "Fine. I'll come get her. But if this turns out to be just for attention, there will be consequences." The car ride home was a symphony of dead silence. She never once asked if I was in pain. She just drove with her jaw clenched tight, radiating waves of pure annoyance. She didn't take me to the emergency room. She took me straight home, tossed me a bag of frozen peas from the freezer and said, Put this on it. And please stop making a scene. That night, the pain was an unbearable, throbbing monster. I muffled my sobs into my pillow, biting down on the fabric to keep from making a sound that might bother them. My ankle swelled to twice its normal size. The next morning, I couldn't put any weight on it at all, and my entire foot had turned a terrifying shade of deep purple. Only then, when the evidence of injury was undeniable, did she relent. Robert drove me to an urgent care clinic, dropping me at the front door like a package he was mailing before he continued on his way to work. The doctor's diagnosis was swift: a clean, severe fracture in 2 places. He looked at me, then at the intake form where the nurse had written down the time of the injury. "This happened yesterday?" he asked, his brow furrowed with a look of deep concern. I just nodded, a hot blush of shame burning on my cheeks. He gave me this look of profound pity, and in a strange way, it was worse than the pain. He knew. He was another person who saw the truth the Winstons refused to acknowledge. Mrs. Gable, the school nurse, followed up a few days later. When she found out they had waited almost a full 24 hours to get me medical care for a double fracture, she filed a formal report with Child Protective Services. It became one of the many crucial bricks in the wall of evidence that Ms. Diaz was building. Then there were the public moments, the ones that burned with a special kind of humiliation. In my sophomore year of high school, I discovered a love for art. I spent weeks on a detailed charcoal portrait for the annual school art show. To my shock, it won a blue ribbon. My art teacher was ecstatic. All parents of the winners were invited to a special reception to see the pieces displayed. I told the Winstons about it. I even pinned the formal invitation to the corkboard in the kitchen. In my neatest handwriting, I wrote a note beneath it. "My art is in the show. 7 p.m. tonight." That evening, I put on my nicest dress, my heart doing that same stupid, hopeful flutter it did on my 10th birthday. I waited in the living room, my hands clammy. At 7 o'clock, Eleanor came downstairs, dressed in her sleek yoga pants and top. "I'm heading out to my class," she said, not looking at me as she grabbed her keys. "The art show," I whispered, the words feeling like dust in my mouth. "It's tonight." She paused, her hand on the doorknob, a flicker of genuine annoyance on her face. "Oh, well, you know your father has his weekly international conference call. And this yoga class is non-refundable. Just take a picture of your ribbon for me." Left. Robert never emerged from his study. I went to the art show alone. I stood in front of my portrait, the vibrant blue ribbon a stark, painful contrast to the hollow ache in my chest. I watched other parents hug their kids, pointing proudly at their work, their faces glowing with reflected pride and love. And when I looked for my own reflection in the crowd, there was just a blank wall where my family should have been. If you're still here with me, don't forget to subscribe, activate notifications, leave your like, and share this video with someone. These moments, these thousands of tiny abandonments, were the bricks that built my prison of invisibility. Ms. Diaz was the first person who ever handed me a sledgehammer. We met every week for months leading up to the court date. First, I barely said a word. Why would she be any different? But she was patient. She just sat with me in the quiet, and her presence wasn't demanding. It was just there. Steady, warm space. "Anna," she said one day, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to carry all of this alone. What happens in that house is not, and has never been, your fault." And for the first time in my life, I truly cried. Not the silent, choked-back tears in my pillow, but huge, heaving, gut-wrenching sobs that tore out of me, a storm of grief I'd held back for a decade. I cried for the 10-year-old with a lonely cake, for the 14-year-old with a throbbing, broken ankle, and for the 16-year-old standing alone and humiliated at the art show. I cried for the ghost in the hallways. Ms. Diaz just handed me tissues and let me grieve the childhood I never had. When the storm finally passed, she looked at me with a fierce determination in her eyes. "The court will see you, Anna," she promised. "We're going to make them see you." The day before the hearing, Eleanor found me in my room. "Anna," she began, her voice tight and rehearsed. "This whole court situation. It's a terrible misunderstanding. You know we've always given you everything." I looked at this woman who was legally my mother and felt nothing but a vast, empty canyon between us. "You gave me a room," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "You didn't give me a home." A flash of anger crossed her face, quickly replaced by a look of weary martyrdom. "We took you in. We gave you a life you never would have had otherwise." It was their unspoken justification for everything, the debt I was supposed to be eternally grateful for. Grateful for the food I ate alone, for the clothes I wore to stand unseen, for the life I was living as a phantom in their perfect house. "A life?" I asked, the bitterness I'd swallowed for years finally rising up like bile. "What life? You don't know the first thing about me. You don't know my favorite color or my best friend's name or what I'm afraid of in the dark. You know nothing about me, because you never once cared enough to look." She recoiled as if I'd slapped her. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving all our unspoken truths hanging in the air between us. In that moment I knew I was ready. I was no longer just going to be seen. I was going to be heard. Section 3. The Day of Reckoning. The courtroom was dark, heavy, and intimidating, with paneled wood walls that seemed to absorb all the light and hope. It was a place designed to make you feel small, and it was working. I sat beside Ms. Diaz, my hands clenched so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were bone white. Across the room sat Robert and Eleanor. They looked utterly out of place, dressed in their usual expensive, understated clothes, like wealthy tourists who had wandered into the wrong building. Robert stared straight ahead, his jaw set in a rigid line of defiance. Eleanor kept dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, a pitiful performance of motherly grief for a bond that had never existed. Then a bailiff called out, "All rise," and Judge Marcus Thorne entered. He wasn't some thunderous, imposing figure from a movie. He was a man in his late 50s with graying hair and a calm, thoughtful face. But when he sat down and looked out over the room, his eyes had a penetrating weight that commanded absolute silence. They were the eyes of a man who had seen it all and could spot a lie from a mile away. And for the first time, a sliver of real hope cut through my fear. He was looking right at me. The Winston's lawyer, a man as slick and expensive as Robert's suit, went first. He painted a picture of a loving, if misunderstood, family. He spoke glowingly of their generosity in a challenging transracial adoption. He carefully described me as a difficult child, prone to melancholy and social anxiety, subtly suggesting that my unhappiness was a character flaw, not a result of their parenting. Then it was Ms. Diaz's turn. She didn't use flowery language or emotional appeals. She just stated the cold, hard facts, one by one, laying the bricks in an undeniable wall of evidence. She brought up the report from Mrs. Gable about my fractured ankle and the 24-hour delay in treatment. She presented the stack of reports from teachers and counselors about my profound social withdrawal. She showed the school records, a history completely devoid of parental involvement, no field trip permission slip signed, no conferences attended, no calls returned. She presented a decade-long, documented pattern of severe emotional abandonment. When Ms. Diaz called my name to testify, my breath caught in my throat. I walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like they were made of lead. Ms. Diaz started by asking about my 10th birthday. As I recounted the story of the forgotten strawberry cake and the lonely lopsided vanilla one I baked for myself, my voice trembled but did not break. I told them about the art show, about the burning humiliation of standing there alone. I told them about my broken ankle, of having my agony dismissed as drama. For the next hour, I gave voice to the phantom child who had lived in silence for so long. When I finished, I was emotionally exhausted, but I also felt lighter. Then Judge Thorne turned his piercing gaze to my parents. He started with Eleanor. "Mrs. Winston," he said, his tone deceptively even. "Anna's artwork won a blue ribbon at the school art show. Can you describe the piece for me?" Eleanor stammered, caught off guard. "It was a drawing. Portrait, I believe. Very nice, I'm sure." "A drawing of what, Mrs. Winston?" the judge pressed, his voice unyielding. I don't recall the specific subject, she mumbled, looking at her lap. Because you never saw it, did you? He stated, more than asked. Silence. He then turned to Robert. Mr. Winston, he began. Tell me, what is your daughter's favorite subject in school? Robert cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. I believe she does well in all her subjects. She's a bright girl. That wasn't my question, Judge Thorne said, his voice losing its gentle edge and taking on a steely quality. I asked for her favorite. The one that makes her eyes light up. The one you would know if you'd ever had a single, meaningful conversation with her about her day. Robert was silent. The silence was a damning confession. Who is her best friend? The judge continued, his questions coming faster, each one a hammer blow. What book is she reading right now? What is she afraid of? What does she dream about for her future? Robert sat frozen, his expensive mask of indifference finally cracking, revealing the hollow man beneath. He couldn't answer a single question. Judge Thorne leaned forward, his moral authority filling every inch of the room. You provided a house, Mr. and Mrs. Winston, but you did not provide a home. You provided for her physical needs, but you starved her soul. The law has a term for this. It is called neglect, and it is a form of abuse as profound and as damaging as any physical blow. He looked from Robert to Eleanor, his eyes filled with a cold, righteous fire. You didn't adopt a daughter, he said, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. You acquired a possession that you then stored in an upstairs room, hoping it would not trouble you. You did not see her because you did not want to see her. And that is a failure on a moral level that this court finds absolutely staggering. Section 4. The judge's justice. The air in the courtroom was thick with unspoken truths. I held my breath, my heart pounding against my ribs. Judge Thorne looked down at the thick file on his desk, then back up at me, his expression softening for a moment. It is the finding of this court, he announced, his voice ringing with finality, that Robert and Eleanor Winston are guilty of severe and prolonged emotional neglect. Therefore, effective immediately, I am ordering the termination of their parental rights. A collective gasp went through the room. Eleanor let out a strangled sob, a real one this time, born of shock and humiliation. Robert just slumped in his chair, all the rigidity gone, his face a ghastly shade of pale. It was over. The invisible chains that had bound me to them for 17 years were broken. Tears streamed down my face, tears of relief, of shock, of a grief so deep and complex I couldn't name it. Ms. Diaz put a comforting arm around my shoulders. I was free. But the judge wasn't finished. He held up a hand for silence. This ruling settles the matter of neglect, he said, his gaze fixed on the thick file before him. But in reviewing this case and the original adoption file from 17 years ago, I found certain inconsistencies, omissions that I find deeply, deeply troubling. He looked directly at Robert, his eyes narrowing. Mr. Winston, this was a private adoption, arranged through the now-defunct Westbrook Agency, correct? Robert's lawyer shot to his feet to object, but the judge cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. Answer the question, Mr. Winston. Robert, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, could only manage a weak nod. An adoption file is a sealed document, the judge continued, his voice low and deliberate. But a judge has the power to unseal those records when it is in the paramount interest of the child's well-being and their fundamental right to an identity. And I cannot imagine a case where that is more warranted than this one. He held up a stapled section of the file. Under the authority of the state's family code, and in the interest of this child's right to her own truth, I am unsealing the confidential addendum to this adoption record. Right here, right now. Robert Winston's face had gone from pale to ashen gray. He looked like he was going to be physically sick. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. Judge Thorne put on his reading glasses and read from the document in a clear, steady voice that cut through the tension. Addendum to Adoption File 73B, 4. It states here that the biological mother, a young woman named Sarah Peterson, relinquished her rights voluntarily. He paused, a dramatic silence that stretched for an eternity. His eyes found Robert's again. The entire courtroom held its breath. It also states, the judge continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more powerful than a shout, that the identity of the biological father was known to the agency, and that the biological father is listed as Robert Winston. The world tilted and went silent. A collective, shocked gasp filled the room. Eleanor's head snapped toward her husband, her face a mask of utter, horrified disbelief. The fake, performative grief was gone, replaced by the raw, violent shock of betrayal. The judge laid the paper down on his desk. The secret was out, exploding into the sterile air of the courtroom, shattering everything. My adoptive father was my biological father. Suddenly, 17 years of confusion snapped into horrifying focus. Eleanor couldn't have children. Robert had an affair. He had a child he couldn't acknowledge, a black child who was proof of his infidelity. So he orchestrated a charitable private adoption to hide me in plain sight, right under his own wife's nose. Eleanor, who never knew the truth, must have subconsciously sensed the fundamental lie at the heart of their family, and rejected the child who was a living symbol of her husband's ultimate betrayal. And Robert, his neglect, his inability to even look at me, wasn't just indifference. It was born from a deep, cowardly guilt. He couldn't stand to see me because when he did, he saw his own secret sin. My entire life, my identity as an unwanted, adopted child, was a lie. A lie built to hide a devastating truth. I wasn't just a ghost to them. I was a secret. And my invisibility was the price of keeping it. Section 5. The Unwritten Future. After that cataclysmic revelation, the Winston Empire crumbled. The judge's ruling became public record, a scandal that their money and influence couldn't contain. Their respectable world shattered into a million pieces. I was placed in the care of the state until I turned 18, which was only a few months away. I lived in a foster home with a woman who treated me with a basic human decency that felt like a miracle. She asked about my day. She made sure I ate. The house was filled with the normal sounds of life, not the oppressive silence I was used to. For the first time I felt seen. The day I turned 18, Ms. Diaz went with me to the county records office. Armed with the court order, I was given my full, unsealed file. My hands trembled as I opened it. I saw my birth mother's name, Sarah Peterson, and the few scant details recorded about her life. Another story, another ghost waiting to be found. But this time the search would be on my terms. My very first act as a legal adult was to change my name. I went to the courthouse and finally shed the name Winston. It felt like taking off a heavy, suffocating coat that never fit, a name that was a brand of shame and deceit. I chose my own name, a name that belonged only to me, a name that represented my future, not their lies. My life isn't a fairy tale. The scars of being a ghost for 17 years don't just vanish overnight. There are days I still feel transparent, moments when the silence of an empty room feels too much like my childhood home. But now the silence is different. It's my own. I can fill it with music, with the laughter of friends, with the sound of my own thoughts. It is a canvas, not a cage. I never saw Robert or Eleanor again. Their justice was the spectacular implosion of their carefully curated lives, the public unveiling of their private hypocrisy. My justice is this: I am here. I am present. I am building a life where I am the main character, not a forgotten footnote in someone else's shameful secret. I am learning day by day to live in the light. The judge didn't just give me justice. He gave me the truth. And the truth, as devastating and as ugly as it was, didn't destroy me. Finally set me free. Thank you for listening to my story. Please subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, comment below, leave your like, and share this video with others.